Welcome to our discussion. Today, we're turning our attention to, well, a very specific 10-year period that completely redefined the global film industry.
It's a huge topic.
It is. We're looking at a decade where the industry moved from a state of near bankruptcy, institutional collapse, to the invention of the modern blockbuster franchise.
It's a massive shift, and not a gentle one. Our mission today is really to analyze the factual evolution of cinema from 1970 to 1979. We're examining that transition from the so-called golden age of classical Hollywood to the new Hollywood era.
And it wasn't a smooth transition at all, was it?
Not in the slightest. It was a period of extreme volatility, extreme risk.
The stakes were just incredibly high. We were talking about a time when major studios were quite literally selling off their office furniture and their historic backlots just to survive. And yet, amidst this financial ruin, they produced some of the most critical and certainly some of the most financial successes in the history of the medium.
It's a paradox, isn't it? Financial desperation often breeds creative risk-taking. You have nothing left to lose.
So how are we going to approach this?
We'll be structuring this discussion geographically and thematically. We'll begin by looking at the explosion of Asian and European cinema before, focusing pretty heavily on the North American Industrial Revolution in film that really took hold in the latter half of the decade.
Okay, let's begin with that global perspective then. One of the most significant developments of the early 1970s was the sudden, really massive surge of interest in Chinese martial arts films.
Yes.
This was not just a local phenomenon. It rippled globally.
The Hong Kong wave, this really begins in the early 1970s. Before this, martial arts films were popular regionally, but they hadn't really crossed over into the Western cultural zeitgeist in a dominant way.
And there's one figure at the center of that.
The pivotal figure here, without any question, is Bruce Lee.
Lee had already been working in the industry, but he wasn't a global superstar yet. He was known in the U.S., but for something else entirely.
That's right. In the 1960s, he was known for playing the role of Kato in the television series The Green Hornet. A sidekick role, really. But his elevation to a true icon of cinema happened when he returned to Hong Kong.
And things happened very quickly for him there.
Incredibly fast. He starred in 3 films in rapid succession that just shot him to stardom all over Asia. You have The Big Boss in 1971, then Fist of Fury in 1972, and Way of the Dragon, also in 1972.
But there was a specific breakthrough moment for this genre in the North American market, though. And it's interesting because it actually predates Lee's biggest international hit.
It does, and this is a crucial data point. In 1973, a film titled Five Fingers of Death, starring the Indonesian-born actor Lo Lei, topped the North American box office.
Which must have been a huge surprise to the studios.
A complete shock. It proved that there was a hungry and, frankly, an untapped audience in the United States for kung fu cinema. That success, that one film, really paved the way for Bruce Lee's films to then come in and completely dominate the U.S. markets shortly thereafter.
And that leads us directly to the absolute peak of the genre in 1973.
Enter the Dragon.
The big one.
This was the first kung fu film to be produced by a Hollywood studio, a co-production. It was a massive financial success. In the United States alone, it grossed $100 million.
Wow.
That is an astronomical figure for the time, especially for a genre that, just a year or two before, was considered completely niche.
Unfortunately, this incredible peak coincided with, well, a real tragedy.
Bruce Lee died shortly before the film's release. He never got to see its full success. And his death created this huge vacuum in the industry.
And the industry tried to fill it.
It did, in a very specific way. The result was a phenomenon that's now known as Bruceploitation. For several years, specifically until around 1978, the Hong Kong film industry just churned out a wave of imitators. Actors who looked a bit like him, used similar names, trying to capitalize on Lee's image and his unique style.
But the genre did eventually evolve past that imitation phase.
Right, it had to. It did. By 1978, the industry, for the most part, moved on. This was largely due to 2 key figures, Jackie Chan and Sammo Hung.
And they brought something completely different to the table.
A completely different energy. They popularized the kung fu comedy subgenre. Films like Snake and the Eagle Shadow and then Drunken Master introduced a lighter, more acrobatic, and much more humorous tone. It allowed the genre to finally step out of Bruce Lee's very long shadow.
Okay, let's move geographically now, over to South Asia. The 1970s was also an incredibly transformative decade for Bollywood.
Yes, in India, cinema in the 1970s really served as a kind of sociological statement. The films were catering directly to rising working-class fantasies and, more importantly, their struggles.
And a very specific archetype emerged from that.
The dominant archetype that emerged was the angry young man.
This was the era of Amitabh Bachchan.
Precisely. The screenwriting duo Salim Javed created this persona, this character, and Bachchan just embodied it perfectly. Films like Zanjeer in 1973 and Diwar in 1975 were these gritty, often violent crime films set in the Bombay underworld.
So not escapist fantasy.
Quite the opposite. They portrayed the young, working-class man from the slums fighting against a corrupt system. It was pure catharsis for a lot of the audience.
And it's interesting to look at the representation of women in these films during the same period, because that also changed quite a bit.
It did, and it almost functioned as a barometer for the economic anxiety of the country.
How so?
Well, in the early 1970s, you had actresses like Parveen Babi, who was actually featured on the cover of Time magazine, which was a huge deal, and Zeenat Aman. They were often shown adopting Western values, Western outfits. They represented a modernizing, more confident India.
But that changed as the decade wore on.
It did. Towards the late 1970s, there was a steep rise in land prices in urban areas and a real decline in employment security. So as this economic anxiety increased, the cinema reverted to more traditional imagery.
A retreat to safety, in a way.
In a way, yes. Heroines like Jaya Prada and Hema Malini were more often depicted as sari-clad women striving for a prosperous, secure middle-class family life. The cinema was reflecting this deep desire for stability in very unstable times.
And before we leave Asia, we should probably mention that this wasn't just about commercial blockbusters. There was a lot of critical acclaim as well.
Oh, absolutely. Malayalam cinema, for instance, saw significant artistic achievements. Adore Gopalakrishnan made Swayam Varam in 1972, which received wide critical acclaim, and that was followed by Nirmalayam in 1973. These films were part of a very serious parallel art house movement.
Okay, let's shift our focus to Europe now. The mood there seems to have been quite different from the high-energy martial arts of Hong Kong or the crime dramas of Bombay.
Very different. The mood in a lot of European cinema was defined by the aftermath of the Prague Spring. Its failure brought about this wave of nostalgia and, I would say, existentialism.
So filmmakers were looking backwards.
They were. They were expressing a sort of yearning for a friendlier social structure that now seemed to be fading or maybe was never really there to begin with.
We see this in specific films, like Sarelma's film.
Yes. Directed by the Hungarian filmmaker István Szabó in 1970, it's a very nostalgic, almost mournful portrayal of that fading ethos. You also have the Italian director Bernardo Bertolucci making The Conformist in 1970, which deals with similar themes of political and social conformity, looking back at the fascist era.
And at the same time, a whole new generation was rising in Germany.
The German New Wave. This was a really important movement. These were directors who had grown up after World War II. Wim Wenders, Werner Herzog, Rainer Werner Fassbinder.
And what were they exploring?
They were asking these deep existential questions about German identity in the post-war world. And then over in Sweden, you had Ingmar Bergman, who just continued to push the medium with Cries and Whispers in 1973, reaching these incredible new levels of psychological expression in motion pictures.
Okay, so let's move to North America now. Because the decade opened with Hollywood in a state of, well, absolute crisis.
It was a financial slump that really reflected the monetary woes of the United States as a whole at the time. But for the studios, it was truly existential.
They tried to pivot in the late 60s.
They had. In the late 60s, they had tried to cater to the youth generation with all these films attempting to replicate the massive success of The Graduate.
But that strategy just failed completely.
Completely. Anti-war films like RPM and The Strawberry Statement were major box office flops. On top of that, they were still trying to make these massive old-school epics. The Pearl Harbor film Tora flopped spectacularly. The studios were in dire straits.
So it really got to the point where they were liquidating their own history just to stay afloat.
That's not an exaggeration. They were unable to repay financiers. Studios began selling off land. They sold their furniture. They sold clothing and props that had been acquired over decades of production.
This is when things like the ruby slippers were sold.
This is exactly when items like Judy Garland's ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz and MGM's own historic backlots were sold off to the highest bidder. I mean, they were literally selling the furniture furniture to pay the rent.
And ironically, the films that actually kept the lights on in 1970 were not these radical youth films they were banking on, but rather very traditional ones.
That is the great irony. The hits were what you'd call old-fashioned films. Summer of 42 cost $1 million and brought in $25 million.
A huge return.
A lifesaver. And then there was Love Story.
The numbers on Love Story are just staggering.
A budget of $2.2 million. It ended up earning $106.4 million. That's the kind of return on investment that single-handedly saves a studio from bankruptcy.
So the audience wanted something else entirely.
They wanted melodrama and tradition.
Wow.
And alongside these, you also had war films that focused on harsh realities rather than the kind of 60s excess. Films like Patton and MMH, both released in 1970, were huge successes.
Speaking of established franchises, the James Bond series was going through a very turbulent, very uncertain transition during this period.
It was a decade of real instability for Bond. You have Sean Connery returning to the role in 1971 for Diamonds Are Forever.
After George Lazenby's single outing.
Right. A one-off. But then Roger Moore takes over in 1973 with Live and Let Die.
And Live and Let Die was successful, wasn't it?
It was. It was the most successful Bond film in terms of admissions up to that point for Moore. But the franchise hit a real low point immediately after. The Man with the Golden Gun in 1974 garnered the lowest box office takings of the series relative to its predecessors.
A sign of trouble.
A real wobble. And then there was a gap.
A 3-year gap, which was unusual for them.
Very significant at the time. This was caused by corporate upheaval. Harry Saltzman, who co-owned the production company Danjaq, sold his half to United Artists. It threw everything into disarray.
But they came back from it.
They did. The franchise didn't pick up again until 1977 with The Spy Who Loved Me. And it ended the decade on a huge high note, however, with Moonraker in 1979 becoming the highest-grossing Bond film of all time until 1995.
While Bond was finding his footing, a completely new genre was exploding in North America. The disaster film.
This trend really began with Airport in 1970. It was an adaptation of an Arthur Haley novel, and the formula was established right there.
What was the formula?
A complex, multi-character plot, an all-star cast of Hollywood legends, and a central melodramatic crisis.
And Airport was a massive financial rescue for Universal.
Oh, it absolutely pulled Universal Studios into the black for the year. It also earned Helen Hayes an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. The success of Airport just created a blueprint. The studios realized if you put a bunch of major stars in a perilous situation with high-budget effects, the audience will absolutely show up.
And we saw the escalation of this genre throughout the mid-70s.
We did. 1972 brought the Poseidon Adventure. You had Gene Hackman leading a cast through a capsized luxury liner. It won an Academy Award for visual effects.
Then came the towering Inferno.
In 1974, that film cost $14 million to produce, which was an incredibly expensive film for its time. 2 studios even had to team up to afford it.
And Earthquake, also in 1974.
Earthquake is notable for its use of, let's say, questionable effects, specifically a lot of camera shake and models to simulate a 9.9 magnitude quake in Los Angeles.
But it worked at the box office.
Despite the criticism of the effects, it earned $80 million. People loved the spectacle. However, the law of diminishing returns eventually set in for the whole genre.
Right. By the late 70s, the audience was getting fatigued.
The novelty just wore off. By the time we get to films like Roller Coaster in 1977, The Swarm in 1978, and Meteor in 1979, the box office returns were dropping significantly. The disaster cycle had run its course.
So while disaster films were providing that big spectacle, there was also a rebirth of gritty realism, particularly in the crime genre.
Yes, the early 70s brought this real focus on street-smart filmmaking. William Friedkin's The French Connection and Sidney Lumet's Serpico are the prime examples.
These were not glamorous films.
Not at all. These were realistic, cynical depictions of police work and corruption. The French Connection featured Gene Hackman as a deeply flawed drug detective, and Serpico told the true-life story of an honest cop fighting rampant internal corruption in the NYPD.
And this era also saw the rise of African-American filmmakers in the crime genre, which was a major development.
A huge development. Films like Shaft and Sweetback's Badass Song were major hits. They created a space for African-American narratives in commercial cinema that hadn't really existed on that scale before.
But they also fell into a pattern.
They did. Similar to the disaster genre, the sequels, like the subsequent Shaft films, saw diminishing returns pretty quickly.
We absolutely cannot talk about 70s crime films without discussing The Godfather.
No, you can't. The Godfather, released in 1972, was a complete phenomenon. It was adapted from Mario Puzo's novel, of course.
And it was so much more than just a gangster movie.
So much more. It dealt with these universal themes of love, pride, family, and greed. It became the highest-grossing film of all time at that moment, earning $134 million in the U.S. and $245 million worldwide. It was a cultural event.
And the sequel followed just 2 years later in 1974.
The Godfather Part 2. And it's one of those very rare instances where a sequel achieved critical parity, some would say superiority, with the original. It won the Best Picture Oscar.
Which is interesting given what happened with the first film.
It is. For the first film, Francis Ford Coppola was actually passed over for Best Director in favor of Bob Fosse for Cabaret. But for Part 2, Coppola took home the statue. A correction of sorts.
Okay, moving away from live action for a moment, the 1970s was also a surprisingly groundbreaking time for animation, specifically animation for adults.
Ralph Bakshi is the key figure here. He's the one who really pushed the boundaries. He released Fritz the Cat, which was the first animated full-length feature specifically oriented towards adults. It was X-rated.
A huge departure from Disney.
A complete departure. He followed that with Heavy Traffic and Coonskin. These films handled mafia themes, ethnic-related urban issues, and gritty street life. These were all subjects previously thought completely unsuitable for the animated medium.
He did pivot later in the decade, though.
He did. He shifted towards fantasy with films like Wizards and his animated version of Lord of the Rings, but his early work was truly revolutionary for the field.
The 1970s also saw the mainstreaming of adult erotic film, a period that's often referred to as the golden age of porn.
This was a very specific and strange cultural moment dubbed porno chic by the New York Times. The phenomenon really inaugurated with Andy Warhol's Blue Movie back in 1969, but it exploded in the 70s.
So this wasn't just a subculture anymore.
No, suddenly adult films were being publicly discussed by mainstream celebrities like Johnny Carson and Bob Hope on their talk shows.
And they were even being reviewed by serious film critics.
Roger Ebert wrote reviews for them. He took them seriously as films. The film that is often cited as the crown jewel of this era is the opening of Misty Beethoven from 1976.
What made it stand out?
It was noted for having a mainstream-level storyline, a plot, and set design, which really distinguished it from the lower-budget, less narrative-driven productions of the past. It was an attempt to legitimize the genre.
Okay, so amidst the blockbusters and the adult films, there was also this very strong current of what's been called the cinema of alienation in the mid-70s.
That's a good way to put it. Films began to reflect the disenfranchisement brought on by the political and social turmoil of the previous decades. The Vietnam War, Watergate.
And what's the key film here?
Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver is the definitive text here. It is a deeply, deeply unsettling look at urban alienation and violence. It earned nominations for Best Picture and Best Leading Actor for Robert De Niro.
And then there was Network.
It portrayed the greed and narcissism in the television media with this biting satire that, frankly, felt incredibly prescient then and feels even more so now. It won Oscars for Peter Finch and Faye Dunaway.
You also had films dealing directly with politics.
Yes, All the President's Men, which dealt directly with the Nixon impeachment context. It was journalism as a thriller.
And yet, amidst all of this dark, cynical cinema, the film that won Best Picture in 1976 was this incredible underdog story.
Rocky. It's amazing. It beat out Network and Taxi Driver. It was a story about a clubhouse boxer from Philadelphia, played by an unknown Sylvester Stallone.
And why do you think it resonated so much?
I think it's because it offered a glimmer of hope. It was about personal triumph against the odds in a decade that was often so cynical and bleak. People needed that.
Now we arrive at the real turning point for the industry's business model, the birth of the blockbuster as we know it.
The year is 1975. The film is Jaws. Before Jaws, The Exorcist had been a massive hit, a true phenomenon. But Jaws is widely considered the first true blockbuster.
It was Steven Spielberg's first big-budget production.
It was. It cost $9 million, which is a lot. It opened on June 20th, and it slowly grew in ticket sales week after week to reach a $260 million domestic gross.
It changed everything.
It fundamentally changed how studios thought about summer releases and marketing. The idea of a summer movie really starts here.
And there was another film around this time, King Kong in 1976, that introduced another specific business practice.
Yes. Dino De Laurentiis produced the remake of King Kong. While it was not the critical or commercial hit that Jaws was, it marked the first time a film was booked into thousands of theaters before a release date.
Saturation booking.
Exactly. This practice of saturation booking is now completely standard for the industry. but it was revolutionary then.
So if Jaws invented the blockbuster, you could say that Star Wars perfected it.
Or blew it into a different galaxy. Star Wars arrived in May 1977. It earned $460 million, surpassing all previous records by a huge margin.
But it was more than just the money, wasn't it?
So much more. It effectively removed the specter of bankruptcy that had haunted the studio since 1970. It proved that a single film could generate an entire economy of merchandise, sequels, and brand loyalty.
And this just completely revitalized the science fiction genre.
Completely. It had been seen as B-movie territory for a long time. But following Star Wars, you immediately had Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 1977, then Superman in 1978, which proved superhero films could be epic and critically acclaimed.
It just opened the door for everything that followed.
It did. And you capped the decade with Star Trek, the motion picture, and Ridley Scott's Alien in 1979. Science fiction was now A-list.
So as we move into the very late 70s, the horror genre was also evolving rapidly.
It really was. It shifted from the supernatural and demonic possession to the slasher. The decade began with The Exorcist in 1973, which was this huge, serious cultural phenomenon.
But that wasn't the direction things went in.
No. By 1978, with John Carpenter's independent film Halloween, we see the clear precursor to all the slasher trends of the 1980s. The masked killer, the final girl, the template is set right there.
And you also had some other grittier cult favorites from that time.
Absolutely. Films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes, these were really raw, visceral horror films that pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable on screen.
And at the same time, the studios were also targeting the youth demographic again, but in a very different way than they had at the start of the decade.
A much more successful way. They were focusing on comedies and music-driven films. Saturday Night Fever introduced disco to Middle America and made John Travolta a superstar.
And then Grease.
Grease capitalized on 1950s nostalgia, another massive hit. And in comedy, you had Animal House and Up in Smoke, which brought this irreverent, anti-authority drug culture humor right into the mainstream.
This is also when we started to see the Saturday Night Live effect.
Yes, the original cast of Saturday Night Live were becoming movie stars.
Yeah.
You had Chevy Chase in Foul Play, for instance. It was the beginning of that talent pipeline, from TV sketch comedy to film stardom.
Finally, as the decade closes, we have to discuss how cinema finally processed the Vietnam War.
It took a long time. It took until the very end of the decade for cinema to really and truly confront the war in a serious way.
And when it did, it was with some major films.
Yes. In 1979, we saw The Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now. Both focused on the deep psychological damage and the sheer horrors of war. And The Deer Hunter won Best Picture. You also had Coming Home, which focused on the difficult lives of veterans after the war.
But there was also a whole subgenre that dealt with this in a different way, right? Vetsploitation.
That's right. These were B-movies, often exploitation films, featuring Vietnam veterans. But unlike the prestige pictures, these focused on action and revenge. They often depicted veterans as volatile, violent time bombs ready to explode. It was a much pulpier, cruder way of processing the same societal trauma.
Which brings us right to the close of the decade, the year 1979.
And it was a huge year. The year 1979 saw the release of Kramer vs. Kramer, this intimate drama about divorce and family dynamics, which won Best Picture.
And you also had a thriller that felt very current.
The China Syndrome, a nuclear thriller that was released right around the time of the 3 Mile Island accident. Incredibly timely. We also had The Muppet Movie. Great family entertainment. It was a really diverse year.
So looking back at the entire trajectory of the decade, it's a remarkable journey.
It really is. I mean, we went from an industry that was literally selling its own props and its own history to pay off debts in 1970 to an industry completely fueled by billion-dollar franchises like Star Wars and Superman by 1979.
A total transformation.
The 1970s created the template for the modern film industry as we know it today. The high-concept blockbuster, the summer movie season, the saturation release, it all started here.
Thanks for listening.